So thank you very much, Sandra. Professor Sandra Thom-Jones is presenting today on inclusive autism research from conceptualization to communication. She's kindly offered her time to I guess, teach us and have a conversation about this really important topic when we're conducting our research. So thank you, Sandra. I'll let you introduce yourself and your topic. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Leah. So yes, I'm going to talk about inclusive autism research. It's great to be here at the University of Wollongong. For my first visit in 10 years, I actually worked at the university for almost 13 years, so it kind of feels like coming home. So I will just, before we get started, ask Leah to do the acknowledgement of country, because I've a long time since I was in this space. Not familiar with exactly whose land I'm on, because I've been on very different land for quite some time.
Oh, thank you, Sandra, for the opportunity to do the acknowledgement. So UOW has a wonderful booklet called You Can't Say That, which I'll post into the chat. It actually describes the acknowledgement of country and how it came about. It also shares a word about how we acknowledge country and how we call out the country we're on, and why we, I guess, leave it up to individuals to determine what country they're from, because every, I guess, First Nations people have a different perception or reality of what that means to them. So we acknowledge here at UOW that country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships, and that we spread our campuses across many sacred landscapes and their intimate relationship with landscape since creation. So I'm not going to say the whole blurb because I'll post in the chat where people can read about that and learn more about what you can and can't say. Thanks very much, Sandra. Over to you now.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you to the traditional owners of the land for allowing me to come and speak to you today. So I am going to start by talking a little bit about what I mean when I'm talking about autism, and hopefully in, I think probably roughly about 40 minutes, I have some time for questions. So it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour, and I'm going to touch on a lot of things that I would love to talk to you about in more depth if I had more time. But hopefully you'll invite me back and we can drill down into some of these issues. Autism is a lifelong condition. It's not a childhood condition, which is what we often sort of seem to hear about and read about, but autistic people are autistic people. We grow from autistic children to autistic adults, but we live in a world where autistic adults are often not visible because a lifetime for many people of discrimination and exclusion means that we tend to be not visible to the community. Autism is not linear. We're not a little bit autistic or very autistic. It's a spectrum. We all have different strengths and different challenges, and approximately 1 in 70 people are autistic. Obviously, you've all probably heard this very famous quote from Stephen Shaw: if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So when I talk about autistic people in this presentation or in any presentation I give, it's important to acknowledge that nothing that I say will apply to every single autistic person. Some things will, some things won't, but autistic people tend to have more in common with other autistic people than we do with neurotypical people. So when I talk about that, it is within that context. I'm more like most other autistic people I know than I am like most non-autistic people I know, but we all have our own unique strengths and challenges, and that's very, very important. I'm going to talk to you about several different aspects of this. I'm going to start with working with the autistic and autism community, which are actually two different things, and I think that's an important distinction. I'm going to start with terminology and language preferences, and anyone who's heard me speak before will know that I tend to use identity-first language. I'm an autistic person. I'm not a person with autism, and these little pictures here kind of describe for you why I feel that way and why I don't use some of the other terminology you might be familiar with. I have a bag. I don't have autism. I live with my cat. That's Abraham. He's beautiful. I don't live with autism, and I don't suffer from autism. I suffer from allergies. It's not, my autism isn't something I pick up and put down. It's not something that is just a part of my life that I separate from or want to separate from. It's not something I suffer from. It's an integral part of me, who I am, and it's a positive aspect of me as well as sometimes a challenging aspect of me. And to me and to many autistic people, that's a really important recognition, and terminology is important, and terminology can hurt. And I think that's my very first important thing to say about doing research with autistic people. Language matters. And language is really important in communicating where you stand in relation to our community. So it's important to be really careful what language you choose when you're talking to people in our community and talking about people in our community, because the words you choose say a lot about the perspective you're taking on who we are and the value that you place on us as people. Obviously, there's lots of other words that are really important. Lots of terminology that people often find confusing. A person is neurodivergent. A community is neurodiverse. Don't call a person neurodiverse. Try to avoid terms like low functioning and high functioning. Those are actually quite offensive and terms that are actually quite meaningless. People often use those terms to classify a person, and to classify a person as a low functioning or a high functioning person is actually quite ableist and quite offensive. No one is in whole as a person, either low functioning or high functioning. I personally find it quite offensive when people say to me, oh, you're an academic, you work at a university, you've written a book, you live in a house that you own, therefore you're a high functioning autistic. There are some things I'm very good at. There's some things that I find very challenging. If you ever saw me try to drive a car, cook a meal, function in a grocery store, you would not describe me as being particularly highly functioning in those situations, in those circumstances. Equally, we often see people dismissed as being low functioning because they struggle with things that in a neurotypical society are seen as things that we determine as a functional thing, like speaking or behaving in certain ways. And then we dismiss someone who actually has a whole range of strengths and skills and capabilities. So we, not using those terms in the way that we write about people and the way we think about people is very important. We have co-occurring conditions. We don't have comorbidities. That's another term I see in research that can often be quite offensive when we say a person with comorbid this or comorbid that, which implies that our autism is some sort of disease or medical condition. And wherever possible, try to avoid the D word. I know it is in the DSM. The DSM does say autism spectrum disorder, but most of us don't like being defined as a disorder when you're actually talking about the way that our brains work. So wherever possible, it's much better to say autism spectrum condition or autism. So that's just a bit about terminology, and I think that is important because, like I said, words matter, and words tell us a lot about how you see us as people. The community. When people often talk about the autistic community and the autism community as if they're interchangeable things, and they're actually two very different things. And that's really important when you talk about inclusive research or inclusive teaching. So people talk about, we did this research and we included the autistic community, or we developed this intervention or this program or whatever else it is that we developed, and they say we developed in collaboration with the community. The autistic community is autistic people. That is the entirety of the autistic community. That's what it consists of. That's quite different to the autism community, which is that much broader entity that consists of parents and carers of autistic people, service providers, families and friends, health professionals and clinicians. There will be different times in different pieces of research where you will want to consult with or participate with or collaborate with those two different communities. But it's really important to know which one it is that you want to work with and which one of those it is that you are working with. Because what we often see is people saying, we did this piece of research and it's about autism, and we worked with the autistic community. And then when you look at it, they didn't actually talk to any autistic people. They talked to some clinicians, or they talked to parents and carers. And that is not the same as actually talking to us as autistic people about our lived experience. That's like saying we're researchers and we're doing this research on women's experiences of menopause. And we consulted with the community because we talked to these women's husbands and we talked to their doctors. And we wouldn't do that. We would never say we wrote an article about women's experiences of menopause by talking to their husbands. But we do that all the time with autistic people. We say we did this great research about the experiences of autistic people. We talk to their mums and dads. And I think it's really important to be careful. There are some situations where you do want to talk to parents and carers, where you do want to talk to clinicians, but it's important to be conscious of when that's the right people to be talking to and when it isn't. So what does collaboration look like? Collaboration is a two-way exchange, that's obvious, but you need to approach that with authenticity and transparency in relation to your intention. So if you are wanting to collaborate with the autistic or the autism community, you need to be genuinely committed to integrating autistic insights. So that means not asking someone to collaborate with you because you're writing for a journal and the journal says you have to have consulted with autistic people, which we are starting to see in journals. And I see a lot of this now where someone's done a study and they've written a paper, and so you'll get an email saying, oh, can you have a look at this and tell us what you think? Or I'm writing this study, can I get your opinion? That is great if you're actually genuinely committed to integrating those insights. But if you just want to tick a box, that's actually can be quite disempowering to the autistic community. And I get a lot of complaints from people in our community who say researchers came and asked us about this, we gave our views on it, but then they didn't actually do anything with those. They didn't take them on board. They went ahead and did exactly what they were going to do anyway. So be very clear about why it is that you want to actually interact with the community. If you are doing collaborative research, then you need to involve autistic people from the very beginning, inception, right through to communicating your findings. So not as a token at a particular point, we'll just get them in here, but really involve them throughout the study. And most importantly, don't expect autistic people to give their time, energy and expertise for free. And I see so much of this where well-paid researchers working in academic, and I know you're a researcher, you probably don't think you're that well-paid, but compared to people in the community, you probably are. People will come to me and say, oh, we're doing this great research project and we've got this grant, and we've got 3 professors and we've got a PhD student on a scholarship. And can you recommend a group of autistic people who will come and advise on this? We'd like to meet with them once a month and get their input. And I say, well, what do what are they being paid for this? Oh no, we don't have a budget to pay them. And the expectation is that these people will give their time and their expertise because they're autistic and they should care about the project. And I think that's something that we really need to change. If you're asking someone to come on board and provide input to your project because they bring expertise that you don't have, then they need to be paid for that expertise in the same way that other members of the team are paid for that expertise. Because that is really about showing that you value their input. They're making your research better and they're making a contribution that you don't have other people in the team to make. So that is really, really important. I'm going to just put in a few little examples from case studies of our research through here, just to give you examples of the sorts of things that I mean. So this is an example of a participatory project. This was some research we did that was funded by AMAZE, which is Autism Victoria. This was the Autism Community Survey. So we did a survey, quite a large-scale survey of the autistic and autism communities around Australia in 2017 and again in 2021. We recruited an expert advisory panel for the development of the project, and these were autistic people recruited to represent a range of intersectionalities. So autistic people, but representing different groups within the community. And they were involved in a process of reviewing and revising the questionnaire that we had used in 2017, which was also developed by a group of autistic people. And the purpose of that was to make sure that the questions reflected the issues that were important to the community, that our question wording was clear, it was appropriate, it was respectful, and also that the length of the survey was manageable. So this was really about making sure this survey was actually going to work for the community. And it was an iterative process. We went through this multiple times. We had face-to-face meetings, we had online meetings, we had time for people to kind of review the questions and provide input. And once we'd refined the survey, we then ran the process, we collected the data, and then we repeated the same process when we had the results. So we got the panel again to come in, look at the initial analysis and our summary of findings, make sure that we were pulling out the things that mattered to the community, that we weren't misinterpreting findings, and then we had them do the same thing with the draft and final reports so that they were happy with what we were reporting on the findings. That the panel was administered by an autism advocate who we actually hired and appointed to role in the university as a member of the team, and all of the panel members were paid for those activities. I was really proud of that project, and that was a project that was really inclusive and very, very much led by the community, and it meant that we produced data that really made a difference, made a contribution, and it was autistic led from beginning to end. So if we start with conceptualizing autism research, autism research is changing. For one thing, it's growing absolutely exponentially. So if we look at the amount of research that was published, decades ago compared to what's being published now, it's just absolutely booming. A crazy amount of research being done. And as awareness of autism and autism research is proliferating, the role of autistic people in autism research is evolving. I mean, originally we were the subjects. It was like doing research on rats or guinea pigs, or we were just the subjects. Then we started to see participation. So, and I would see that as sort of almost like nominal. We'd go grab an autistic person off the street and we'd say, well, we'd like you to have a look at this, but we're not really taking you as an equivalent to us. You just come and have a look, and we can say we had an autistic person participate. And we're now seeing research that's truly collaborative. Some examples of research that's truly collaborative, where autistic people are being seen for the value they bring as equal collaborators in research projects. But despite these advances and the growing number of autism researchers that do exist in academia, the majority of autism research is still conceptualised and conducted by non-autistic researchers. And that's okay. I'm not saying non-autistic researchers shouldn't do autism research. They absolutely should. But I think it's important that autism research is not done by teams that are completely devoid of autistic people. In the same way that we wouldn't set up leading teams of researchers into women's issues that didn't have any women in, or research into issues affecting people of colour that didn't have any people of colour in, any minority group. Now, in terms of identifying collaborators, there's two types of collaboration and they overlap. We can collaborate with the autistic lay community, which is a very important aspect, and that's something that, obviously projects that are involving autistic people should do. And that's like the project that I described earlier, where we had members of the community come in and really inform our survey development and the analysis and reporting of our results. And there's also collaboration with autism researchers. And there are many autism researchers, obviously for a whole bunch of reasons that we won't get into. A lot of them haven't disclosed because academia is not necessarily a safe place to disclose. But there are many who have disclosed and are very active researchers in the autism space. If you, listening to this, are an autism researcher yourself, there are lots of networks and alliances and platforms where you can actually connect with other autistic researchers. For example, there's a Facebook community. There are also some other groups for autistic researchers, so you can reach out to me outside of this and I will connect you, because obviously some of those are not public, but there are some private autistic-only groups that you can join to collaborate with other autistic people. If you're a non-autistic autism researcher and you're not currently collaborating with autistic colleagues, you can look to see who's publishing in your area of interest, who identifies as autistic, and reach out to them and see if they're interested in collaborating. There's also, on my website, I have quite a long list of openly autistic academics, including the links to their university affiliations if you're looking for people to collaborate with. So there's, in the current situation we're in now, there is really no reason not to collaborate with autistic people in your research team, because there are so many of them out there, really top quality researchers who are available to collaborate with people. In terms of deciding what you're going to research, there is also a growing body of work in that space about determining the priorities. If we're really serious about doing research that matters to the community, we should be finding out, what does the community want? And this is just a small piece of work I did looking at what do autistic adults working in academia, so what do autistic researchers think the priorities should be? And what we found, they said, well, we definitely need less research, looking what's the cause, what's the cure. We've had more than enough of that, and we're not necessarily wanting to be cured anyway. We need less research on how can we fix or train autistic people how to think like the neuromajority. We need less research that positions autism as a deficit. Obviously, we need less research that's not participatory and doesn't take into account autistic perspectives. But we need a lot more research that's actually seeking to improve the lives of autistic individuals, regardless of age. And I would say particularly adults and older adults, because there's a lot in the space of autistic children, and the older you get, the less research there is. We need more research around stereotypes and misperceptions, and particularly on highlighting the strengths of autistic people, which is really under-researched. We need more research on co-occurring conditions, and we need more research that really demonstrates how we involve autistic people from inception to dissemination. So that's a perspective from the view of autistic researchers, but there's lots of ways that you can identify topics of interest in your discipline. You can ask autistic people in your local community. If you don't have direct access to the autistic community, there's lots of other places you can look. The National Disability Research Partnership has published quite a lengthy research agenda. That's not specific to autism, that's about disability in general, but it's really quite expansive and definitely worth looking at. Most autism advocacy groups have position statements that outline areas for research, and there's a growing number of peer-reviewed published papers about community priorities. I've just realised there's a typo in my last reference there, and it's missing the year, but I'll fix that. So there's lots of great peer-reviewed papers that have got the priorities of autistic adults. What research are they looking for in that space? So there's lots of places you can go if you're looking, what should I do research on that really matters to the community? If you don't have direct access to the community, there are lots of existing resources where you can look for possible topics. And I would say those are the starting places, rather than trying to look at, okay, what's an area that might be of interest to the discipline, what's of interest to the community, because that's how you do stuff that really matters. Right, so you've conceptualized, you've come up with an idea, you've got people to work with, you know what the topic is. Now we want to actually design a collaborative autism research project. Some of the things to consider in establishing your project. How do you frame your research question? The biggest thing I would say is try to avoid taking a deficit lens. I've just finished doing a systematic literature review, which has just been accepted. I'm really excited about this. It's about parenting, as being an autistic person, parenting. And one of the things that's really disturbing for me reviewing the literature is the immediate deficit lens that is taken to research with autistic people. So many of the studies that we reviewed went from the perspective of, where are autistic people failing as parents? What are the problems they're experiencing? Where are they going wrong? And whenever studies actually found that autistic people weren't less effective parents than non-autistic people, or even, shock horror, autistic people were doing really well as parents, these findings were presented as unexpected or surprising findings, that actually they had good relationships with their children or they had good parental outcomes. So that's really important about framing your question and your research lens in terms of not taking that deficit focus. And remembering that this is a group of people, like any group of people, that has strengths as well as challenges. So making sure that your question encompasses that. What's our agreed methodology and what are the most appropriate methods for the research? Standard approaches aren't always the best. So it's worth looking at recent autistic-led research in your area of interest. And who are our stakeholders? Who are we going to collaborate with? Who are our participants? And who are the beneficiaries of our research? Because that's really going to help you decide what direction you want to go in. We wouldn't talk about research without talking about ethics. Ethics committees often automatically define autistic individuals as vulnerable, regardless of capacity. And I understand the urge to protect us, but not including us can be even more ethically problematic than including us. And I think we need to be really careful there. I've seen that too often where we're told, oh, you shouldn't include those people because they might not be cognitively capable of making a decision whether to participate. If you exclude our voices, then that's actually really harmful, because surely we are the people who are best placed to decide whether we want to have a voice, and not letting us have a voice and instead allowing our caregivers or our partners or our parents or our clinicians to speak for us is ethically problematic. Context is important. So who are the participants? What's the focus of the study? What are the risks of participating and not participating? I would say things like, do you have autistic researchers or advisors involved in the project who know what the issues are for the community members is really important, and what safeguards and supports are in place. So it's really about making sure you can do the work, the research in a way that is ethical and safe. But also be aware that ethical research doesn't just mean having ethics approval. And I've come across far too many studies that had ethics approval, but I would really question whether they were ethical. So are your participants being made to feel valued and respected? Do your collaborators feel valued and respected? Is the reporting of the study findings respectful? I've seen papers come out where even if they were anonymised, people would clearly be able to identify the participants. And I haven't cited this because I don't want to identify the researcher, but I have come across a paper where they had one participant, and be that as it may, although that participant might not have been identifiable to other people, that participant was clearly identifiable to themselves. So if I participated in a study and I know I'm the only person who participated in that study, then when that article comes out, I know that's me. And in that article, they made some really dismissive comments about that participant. Comments like, it's not clear whether this person's issues were related to discrimination or whether they were just not a very nice person. And they wrote that about this person who had given up their time to participate in their study and would clearly be able to identify themselves. And they wrote this and published it in a journal. To me, things like that, those are the things that I would think about as ethical considerations, whether you get past an ethics committee or not. When people publish a paper and they make comments that basically are quite negative about their participants, those things, you know, you lose the trust of the community. Aside from the fact that it's just unkind and totally unreasonable, I'd be wary as a member of the community of participating in that kind of research. Instrument design is, I know I'm talking a lot and I'm talking fast, but I have so much to say. Instrument design is a huge issue when you're working with our community. Autism research continues to study so many important aspects of our lives using measures that were developed by non-autistic researchers for non-autistic participants. And we are not the same as you. We don't think the same as you. We don't communicate the same as you. And I understand the assumption that if you alter an established scale, you limit the validity of the research findings. I get that. Change the scale, terrible thing to do from a psychometric perspective. But if we're using a measure that is not appropriate and relevant to the autistic community, then your findings aren't valid anyway, because if it's not relevant to me, and if I'm not interpreting it the way that you think I'm interpreting it, then the fact that I've answered it in the way you thought I was going to answer, it doesn't mean that your results actually are meaningful. And I think that's really, really important. Does this question mean the same thing to an autistic person that it means to a non-autistic person? And often the answer is no. If you're developing measures or modifying measures, you need to make sure that you're using respectful and neuroaffirming language. I have seen so many, not just to protect our community, I think that's important, but also to protect your own research. I have seen so many surveys go live, particularly on social media. People say, please participate in my survey. And then you see 1,000 comments hit within minutes where people say, I started your survey, I got to question 3. The language was so ableist and anti-autistic that I stopped. And your research is dead, because people are not going to complete it because the terminology is offensive or hurtful. So it's injuring your study as well as the people you're trying to research. So when we do instrument design, we take this really reiterative and reflexive approach. So we refine the language and the terminology. We make sure that the question is being interpreted in the way it's meant to be interpreted, and try to anticipate potential errors in data analysis. So there's this really good paper. I'm not going to go through these in detail because you'll have access to these slides, I'm sure. But great paper by Nicolaides and colleagues, where they looked at what are the common problems in existing measures identified by autistic people across a range of studies and a range of measures. And they're things like vocabulary that's confusing or figures of speech that are not interpreted by autistic people the same way they are by non-autistic people. Complex sentence structure, confusing grammar, imprecise response options. Any autistic person I know, including myself, started filling in a survey and I look at the response options and I think, it's not quite that one and it's not quite that one. And we can spend hours looking at it thinking, well, none of them are quite right. Or a common thing is when you get questions that are things like, you know, would you prefer to do A, B, or C? And we want context because we live in a world that needs context. And I want to know, would I want to do A, B, or C in what situation? I can't answer that. So there's really common things that have been found across multiple studies, across multiple instruments that will make it really, really difficult for autistic people to complete your survey. So highly recommend that article if you're trying to develop an instrument that you're going to use with autistic people. It's really helpful because it also includes suggestions on how to modify your instrument. So definitely worth a read. This is a really simple example of, it was a study we were doing with autistic children, and we had an expert review committee of autistic people. So this was this is an existing measure, self-perception profile for children, and apparently most kids can answer this question. So the idea is you're supposed to kind of describe yourself, and on one side you've got some kids find it hard to make friends, and on the other side, other kids find it pretty easy to make friends. And you're supposed to tick which one's more true of you. I could not answer this question. And we got a whole group of autistic people, young people and older people to try, and they all struggled with this question because we could not put ourselves in the head of these other kids. And so we got completely confounded by this. Some kids find it hard to make friends and other kids find it pretty easy to make friends. But I'm not some kids, I'm me. So then we adjusted the wording to I find it hard or I find it easy, which is more like me. And all of the autistic people we had could just go tick, tick, tick and answer all the questions on the scale. Now, I know Harter would probably have conniptions if they knew that we'd modified the scale. But for our participants, we needed to do that for them to actually be able to interpret the question. So that's just one like really simple example, but that can make the difference between a group of autistic people actually being able to complete an instrument, interpret, understand the question and respond to it, or just sit there saying, look, I don't understand what it is that you want me to do. So it really is important to think about, are these questions that were designed for non-autistic people actually going to work for autistic people? All right, implementing projects. A whole bunch of things to consider. Obviously, recruitment. It can be really hard to recruit autistic study participants. We're over-researched. You're much more likely to be successful if your study addresses an issue that's important to our community and if your recruitment materials are autistic affirming. So if we look at it and we think, this sounds like a study that's been developed for people like me, and the language makes sense to me and sounds friendly. Obviously, if you're approaching an autistic colleague or a community group, remember that they're probably going to get lots of requests, and they're often seen as gatekeepers to their networks. And there's a sense of safety and trust. So if you ask an autistic network or community group to promote your study, that's their reputation. If they promote your study, they have to know that it's a good project, it's a safe project, and that there are community benefits. So if you're going to ask them, those are the things that you need to be able to be confident that you can promise them. This is safe for people to participate in. It's not going to cause them any harm, and there is some benefit. What are they getting for participating in your research? If you're doing survey research, there's a range of things to consider. This is not a comprehensive list, just a few things. One of the things you see often, most survey research is done with what I call captive audiences. We get groups of people in healthcare or groups of people in education settings. But there's lots of other ways, you know, mailing lists, advocacy groups, social media obviously is a great way of getting autistic people, snowballing. So look at ways of getting people where they're at rather than just that captive audience. Let's get them all at university, or let's get them all when they turn up at the doctors, because that's getting a limited group. Think about your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Are you actually after autistic voices? Do you want autistic people, or are you going to use proxy reports? So are you looking at what do parents say about autistic people, and remembering that those are different voices? So if you are using those proxy reports, parents or carers, then remember that it's not the same as asking autistic people. Are you requiring people to have a diagnosis? I see that a lot in studies. People say we are looking for autistic people, but you have to be diagnosed as autistic. If you do that, then you're cutting out over half of autistic adults, because the barriers to diagnosis, cost barrier particularly, means that many autistic adults don't have a diagnosis. So that's a consideration. And then things to think about, like completion methods. You know, if you're doing an online survey, things like allowing people to stop and start rather than having to do the whole survey. Can they stop? Can they save it? Can they come back to it? Because sometimes we have limited energy to keep going. Can I change my answers? That's a really important one for me as an autistic person, because sometimes I tick a box and then I think that was the wrong box and it won't let me go back and change it. And I get really upset and anxious, and so I'm going to stop filling in your survey. Some of those things you can pre-test with people, but those sorts of considerations can make a big difference. Information sheet, you know, give me the information. Tell me a little bit about you. Why are you doing this survey, and why should I trust you with my information? Obviously, use survey questions, but also tell me why you want to know what you want to know. If you're putting in particular questions or particular batches of questions, just give me a little bit of information about why you are asking me these questions, so I know that there's a reason. If you're doing interviews, again, there's a whole bunch of things to consider there. What's the best interview format? You can do face-to-face interviews, online, phone interviews. Where are you going to do the interviews? Can I do it somewhere that I feel safe and I feel comfortable? Consider the sensory issues. Don't ask me to come into a brightly lit room in a noisy place that I've got to drive half an hour to get to and stress about parking my car, because I won't come. And if I do come, I'm going to be a mess in the interview. Be aware of communication issues. I communicate differently to you. I may not express myself in the same way. My body language is different. My information processing speed is different. So if you're interviewing autistic people, you need to really be aware of that. wherever possible, I would have an autistic person interview autistic people. If you can't do that, just make sure you really understand those communication differences and you're sensitive to them, and don't interpret the interviewee's responses in a neurotypical way. Things like eye contact, body language, remember that they don't mean the same thing. And make sure that you do what you can to reduce their anxiety. So if I'm coming to do an interview as an autistic person, I want sufficient information. I want to know exactly where to come, exactly what's going to happen. I want to see the questions in advance. If you want a good interview outcome from me, let me know in advance what you're going to ask me so I'm not thinking on the spot, and let me know what's going to happen. Obviously, you know, better integrity. If you've got some autistic researchers in the team, you can have some non-autistic ones as well if you want. But, you know, that way you've got someone who can actually interpret autistic ways of thinking and communicating, because sometimes people will say things in a survey or an interview that means something to an autistic person quite different to a non-autistic person. Allow member checking wherever it's feasible, because, you know, letting me check that you've interpreted what I said correctly is really helpful. And consider community feedback and a reality check when you've, you know, drafted up your results. Get some community feedback on, is that actually what this means? Quick example, this is from our autistic parenting study. So we interviewed 93, that's a lot of people, believe me, 93 is a lot of interviews. We interviewed 93 people about their experiences as autistic parents. We gave them the questions in advance, so they had plenty of time to think. They had the choice of being interviewed by phone, by Zoom, or by email. They could control, did they want the videos on, the videos off, did they want chat settings on or off? They could choose the day, date, and time for the interview. They weren't limited to text and audio, so they could also provide photos or drawings or artwork to support what they wanted to say, because we're not all communicators in words. Some of us are visual communicators. They could also provide further information when the interview was finished, because we don't necessarily process information quickly. And sometimes we think of the right answer an hour after the interview is finished. So we said, you can have as long as you like. You can send additional information later. And we also gave them the option to review and edit their interview transcripts. And we thought that was really important, because sometimes we say things and it's not quite what we mean. And being able to get their transcripts back and edit them and say, no, actually, I didn't mean this, I meant that, or I used the wrong word, that really made people feel comfortable that they were able to communicate what they actually wanted to communicate. And as I say, we got amazing data. Almost at the end, I am going to leave time for questions. Communicating your findings. Just a couple of little tips here. Before you publish, if you're not autistic, or even if you are autistic, you're going to be interpreting your research findings from the perspective of your own lived experience. So you want to check for any potential for harmful content. So that means where you might have said something that could be interpreted to actually be offensive, or could cast negative views of our community, or you know, you're talking about a community where people have experienced, for many people, a lifetime of stigmatization and discrimination. So we want to be careful that we're not putting stuff out there that adds to those stereotypes and adds to those stigmas. You want to check for potential identifiers. I mean, yes, you've put pseudonyms in, but our community can be quite small. And so you want to make sure that you've made sure you've taken out anything that could potentially identify people by naming schools or giving specific examples. And consider target audience review. One of the things that I always do before I publish a journal article is I get a group of autistic people who weren't involved in the research to read the article completely fresh and give me their feedback. Does this summarise issues on this topic that are really important to the community? Is there anything else I should have said? Is there anything I appear to have misinterpreted? And I find that gives a kind of level of review that's really helpful. Obviously, you know, journal publications, you know, bread and butter for universities, but they're often not accessible to the people who actually stand to gain from the research. And I know that journals, you know, a lot of journals now ask for lay summaries and offer open access options, and those are great. Really encourage those, but lots of things to think of beyond the journal. So media articles, social media articles are great ways of sharing your findings. plain language summaries, fact sheets, infographics, things that put your research out there in a form that people can use it. Community conferences and presentations are obviously, you know, really great ways of sharing your information more broadly for people who want to actually hear it and have an opportunity to ask questions. Industry events, conference presentations, public speaking, there's so many ways beyond journal publication that you can get your research out there to people. So this is just one little example. This is my work on the experiences of autistics in academia, which is probably something close to the heart of some of the people here. A couple of journal articles in autism, because that's, you got to do that, don't you? I have a book coming out in September with Cambridge University Press. I had an article summarising the findings in a mainstream autism parenting journal. I've done presentations at universities on the findings. I've done a range of different community presentations. I had an article in The Conversation. So to me, that was really important, even though my target was predominantly academics. I also wanted to share this more broadly because I wanted people to see that this is a space where autistic people belong, because it's also really important to share that with other people who would like to be future academics, you know, kids at high school, parents. So to me, there's so many different ways we can share that back to the autism community. I don't expect you to speed read this, but that's just some recent publications that might be of interest, and I'm sure you'll get copies of the slides. And that's it, and I'm going to finally stop talking and allow questions, and I assume Leah is going to host the questions.
Hi Sandra, that was great, and really like so much of what you spoke about, you know, that authentic and meaningful engagement with our research participants and collaborators, and just, you know, in whomever we're working with, that it really builds credibility as well, like for your own person as a researcher. But I think it's just kind of being a good human as well. So that's really great. You know, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise in that. Yeah, context and practical approaches I wrote down, and with applied examples. That was a wonderful talk. So Jenny Hunt also said thank you very much, and for validating many of the beliefs that she shares with you, and she thinks you're wonderful. So yeah, there aren't any questions. If you wanted to post questions in the chat, I'm happy to ask them on your behalf. Otherwise, I mean, Sandra, it kind of, it's quite apparent that by co-creation and including your research, whether it's autistic people or the autism community in your research and that developing and conceptualization, it only serves to further maximize and amplify the impact of your research work. So it kind of seems like, is it a lot of work to start up, like, you know, to get to that relationship building stage?
Yes, but I think it's really important work. I think it's unfortunate that it's not work that's typically rewarded by universities. So it's work that as a researcher you do in your own time. I mean, obviously for me in some ways it's different because it's my community. So to me, it's the important part of what I do, because it's why I do what I do. And there are, obviously, as an autistic researcher and an autism advocate, it's a community that I already kind of live in and am part of. So building those connections is in many ways much easier than it would be for a non-autistic researcher kind of trying to come into that space. But I think the rewards, even as a non-autistic researcher, the rewards are there in both directions, because if you're doing research that's really meaningful, for me, the most amazing thing as a researcher is when you publish a piece of research in a form that's accessible and someone reads it and they come back and they say, the outcomes of that made this difference to my life. You know, I did that thing with this or because of this, and it's actually had an impact. That's much better than being cited, right? By some, you know, you wrote an article and some other academic read it. Well, yeah, wow. But you did this thing and it actually made a difference to someone. But also as a researcher, it makes your research so much better. You know, I couldn't do the research that I do and get the sample sizes that I get and the quality of data that I get if I didn't have those relationships. But I have those relationships because people know that I'm genuine and I have a genuine commitment to actually doing good quality research that respects their values and respects their participation and is committed to feeding that back to them. So it takes a lot of energy, but it's worth it.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. There is a question about co-designing lecture material and how this could be progressed at a university.
I think that's a really important question. I think it's not different in many ways to research. I think there's lots of opportunities for co-designing lecture material. I don't think it happens enough across pretty much any discipline. Just as there are many great autistic researchers, there are many great autistic people working in lots and lots of disciplines. So I think really it's about finding out who has the expertise in that discipline. So whether it's an autistic person who's teaching in that discipline or whether it's members of the autistic community with some sort of experience in that discipline, either as a professional or as a client or user of the services offered by that discipline. But I do think that's, I mean, obviously it depends what you're teaching. Like if you're teaching about autism, then that's different to if you're teaching about something else. But there are many people who are out there and are available to support that. And I think it's really important. Probably the biggest gap is where we see people teaching about autism who are not involving autistic people in the development of materials. And I see that a lot, both in terms of course content at universities, but also in other environments, and also in autism support programs that are developed completely by neurotypical people or in partnership with parents and carers. And that's not the same thing as involving autistic people. You know, I would love to see autistic co-design of all autism-related content in universities, but I'd also like to see autistic people involved in a lot of the development, particularly of assessment pieces across all disciplines, because I think we could make universities a lot more autism friendly than they currently are.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you're doing great work already just by raising the profile of autistic people and the autism community just through this talk and sharing your insights with. Earlier today, you met with the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion team and, you know, now our researchers. So I think, you know, just even talking about it with autistic people and non-autistic people gives us all a perspective that we may not hear all that often. So it's really important that you're able to share that with us. So thank you. There is another big question in there, but in terms of, I'm not sure if you can read this one. It's essentially if this person has an idea for a topic and they're looking at the validity of autistic play and how being allowed to play in a variety of ways influences a child. How would you get started in the research world if you've just got some great ideas, but you're not necessarily an established researcher yourself? Like if you have some great ideas, where do you go with that kind of thing?
You've got some great, so we're talking, I assume, I'm sorry, I can't see the chat at the moment.
Right.
I'm assuming we're talking a non-autistic researcher has a great idea and wants to get started.
Yeah.
I would say, obviously, the first thing is to look at what's out there in the literature. I would see if you can find autistic researchers who are working in that space and reach out to them. One of the things that you will find, and I think I touched on this morning at my NDI presentation, our community tends to be very inclusive, very supportive, very welcoming. So often you will find that people are very open to being supportive and helpful, because we've often experienced that other people are not. So I would be looking to see what research has been done in that space by autistic researchers, because that's where you're going to get the most autistic affirming approaches. Who else is working in that space? And be open to taking advice. I think that's probably one of the things. Autistic positions on these are often quite different to what's in the literature, because the literature often comes from a very deficit focus, and often quite an ableist focus. So the autistic perspective on this might be quite different, but it's really worth kind of seeing, okay, who's in that space? Who can I reach out to? If you can't find someone who's sort of specifically in that discipline and openly autistic, then, you know, reach out to an autistic academic. As I said, there's a long list of autistic academics on my website. It's worth having a look there, see if you can find someone relevant. If not, you're welcome to email me and I'll see if I can link you to someone who's in that space. My space is very much around adults. I do, you know, sort of university and up. But, you know, I'm happy to try and link you to someone. I think it's really, if you're starting out, given that we really are seeing this move to inclusive research and recognising the importance of inclusive research, I would say start with inclusion, right? Start with finding who can I work with, who's autistic, what are the opportunities to build really inclusive research, and start there, rather than starting from the negative space of not being inclusive and then trying to move into the inclusive space.
Yeah, that's great. It's very generous of you to offer your I guess, connecting up with you. Yeah, the person who presented that question, there's the details for Sandra, and hopefully she can help you on your journey, which sounds like a really, really worthwhile question to investigate. So we're at 3:29, Sandra. I'd like to say thank you for your time again. A wealth of information, and, you know, language matters, as you said. Words create worlds. It's really important that we hear these words and we learn about our world and how different it might be for all of us. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's good to be back at Wollongong, and you know, I'll come back again and talk to you more another time.
Lovely. Thanks, Sandra.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, everyone.